On New Year's Eve, my mother handed generous financial gifts to every single grandchild in her lavish Buckhead mansion, purposely skipping over my 7-year-old son. My brother's white wife smirked and announced that my boy just was not good enough to earn a gift. I did not scream. I did not cause a scene. I simply looked at them, told them to never invite us again, and walked out the door. Exactly 7 hours later, at 7 in the morning on January 1st, my family received a special New Year delivery at their front door that would shatter their fake wealthy reality forever. Growing up in the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta, my family projected an image of absolute perfection. My parents were prominent figures in the local social scene, always hosting charity galas and exclusive country club dinners. But behind the heavy mahogany doors of our sprawling estate, the reality was a suffocating hierarchy where love was conditional and affection was treated as a currency to be earned. My older brother Marcus was the undisputed golden child. He was groomed to take over my father's business ventures, celebrated for every minor achievement, and shielded from every consequence of his terrible decisions. I, on the other hand, was the constant disappointment. I was the quiet, observant girl who chose to study finance instead of joining the right sororities or marrying into the right families. The annual New Year's Eve party at my mother Beatrice's house was always a grand affair, designed specifically to showcase our family's supposed wealth and status to the rest of the Atlanta elite. Caterers circulated with expensive champagne, while a jazz trio played softly in the background. The house smelled of expensive perfume-roasted meats and the sharp scent of pine. I sat quietly in the corner of the massive living room, watching my 7-year-old son Malik play with his new toy car. Malik is a brilliant, gentle boy, an honor roll student who loves science and reading. He has never asked for much, always content just to be included. But in my family, being sweet and smart was never enough. You had to be loud, boastful, and perfectly aligned with my mother's pretentious image. The centerpiece of the evening was always the midnight gift distribution. It was a tradition my mother loved because it forced everyone to gather around her, like subjects paying tribute to a queen. At exactly 15 minutes before midnight, Beatrice took her place by the massive marble fireplace. She was wearing a custom silk gown, holding a stack of thick, ornate red envelopes. Everyone knew what was inside those envelopes. They contained substantial savings bonds and checks for the grandchildren's trust funds. The entire room fell silent as she began calling out names. Marcus stood near the fireplace with his wife Harper. Harper is a white woman who married into our African-American family a few years ago, bringing with her an astounding level of entitlement. She loved to play the role of the wealthy socialite, constantly looking down her nose at me while spending my family's money as fast as Marcus could hand it to her. Their son Hunter, who was the same age as Malik, was standing front and center, already grabbing at the envelopes before his name was even called. My mother handed a thick red envelope to Hunter, smiling warmly as she patted his cheek. Then she turned. She walked directly toward where Malik and I were sitting. Malik, bless his sweet heart, stood up and took a hesitant step forward, reaching his small hand out with a hopeful smile on his face. He thought it was his turn. Instead, my mother looked right past him, stepped around his outstretched hand, and handed the final envelope to my cousin's teenage daughter standing right behind us. Malik froze. His little hand slowly dropped to his side, and the confusion in his bright eyes completely shattered my heart. He looked up at me silently, asking what he had done wrong. Before I could even pull him into my arms, Harper's shrill voice cut through the quiet chatter of the room. She took a sip of her champagne, smirked, and reached out to aggressively ruffle Hunter's hair. "I guess Malik just did not meet the standards for Grandma's gift this year," she announced, making sure her voice carried perfectly across the living room. "Try to get straight A's next time, kiddo. Maybe then you will be good enough." The sheer audacity of her statement left me momentarily breathless. Malik had received straight A's on every single report card since he started school. Hunter, on the other hand, was notoriously struggling in every subject, constantly requiring expensive private tutors just to pass. It was a blatant, cruel lie, designed specifically to humiliate my son in front of 50 guests. I waited for anyone to correct her. I looked at my brother Marcus, who just chuckled and took another sip of his drink. But the ultimate betrayal came from my mother. Beatrice did not scold her daughter-in-law. She did not comfort her grandson. Instead, she adjusted her diamond necklace and let out a cold, dismissive sigh. "This family only invests in children with a solid future, Nia," my mother said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "You need to teach that boy how to be independent. You cannot expect us to fund your life forever. Not good enough. Be independent. Not good enough. Be independent." The words hit me like a physical blow, instantly transporting me back through decades of psychological torment. It was the exact same chorus I had heard my entire life. When I was 16 and needed money for a college prep course, I was told to be independent while Marcus was gifted a brand new luxury car for barely graduating high school. When I chose to build my own career in financial risk management instead of relying on my father's connections, I was told I was not good enough to understand real business. Not good enough. Be independent. They had used those phrases to systematically break my spirit for 20 years, and now they were using them to break my 7-year-old son. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the living room. The guests awkwardly looked down at their drinks, completely unwilling to intervene in the family drama. They expected me to shrink away. They expected me to lower my head, swallow my pride, and quietly accept the humiliation, just like I had always done in the past. They thought the quiet, observant Nia would just take the emotional beating and cry in the car later. But they were wrong. I did not cry. My vision narrowed, focusing sharply on the smug faces of my mother and my sister-in-law. All the years of trying to earn their love evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. I calmly stood up, smoothing the front of my dress, and placed a protective hand on Malik's shoulder. "You are exactly right, Mom," I said, my voice steady and ringing with absolute authority. "Malik does not need these pennies to know his true worth. I will make sure he learns how to be truly independent, far away from people who measure love by bank accounts." I then turned my gaze directly to Harper, who was still wearing that arrogant smirk. I stepped slightly closer to her, ensuring every word I spoke would land with maximum impact. And Harper, I continued, maintaining relentless eye contact. "Straight A's cannot be bought with savings bonds. Just like genuine wealth cannot be faked. You might want to hold on to that envelope very tightly, especially since your household trust fund is about to run completely dry." Harper's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer confusion and rising panic. Marcus spilled a bit of his drink, his head snapping toward me as the color drained from his face. My mother opened her mouth to demand an explanation, but I did not give her the chance. I turned my back on the entire room, grasped Malik's hand firmly, and walked toward the front doors with my head held high. "Never invite us here again," I stated clearly over my shoulder before stepping out into the cold December night. The valet brought my car around quickly. I strapped Malik into his car seat, kissing his forehead and promising him that we were going to have our own special celebration at home. As I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, the adrenaline finally caught up with me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or sadness. I felt an overwhelming sense of power. I pulled my phone out of my purse and opened a secured, encrypted folder. Inside was a digital execution order I had painstakingly prepared and held onto for 3 agonizing months, waiting for the perfect moment. I stared at the sprawling, illuminated mansion through my windshield one last time, watching the silhouettes of my toxic family moving behind the expensive curtains. They honestly believed they held all the power. They honestly believed I was just a struggling freelance consultant. They had no idea that I managed distressed debt portfolios for some of the wealthiest athletes in the country. And they had absolutely no idea that I legally owned every single secret they had been desperately trying to hide. With a slow, deliberate breath, I pressed the send button on my screen. The legal orders were instantly dispatched to the county sheriff's office and my legal team. The dominoes were officially in motion. My mother and brother thought they had ruined my New Year's Eve, but they were about to wake up to a reality where they had absolutely nothing left to celebrate. 7 o'clock in the morning on January 1st. The sun had barely begun to cast a pale winter light over the sprawling mansions of Buckhead. But I was already wide awake. I sat at the quartz island in my own quiet, peaceful kitchen. A steaming mug of black coffee rested in my hands. On the counter in front of me, my tablet screen displayed a crisp, high-definition live feed. It was the security camera system at my parents' estate. I had personally researched, purchased, and installed that entire system 5 years ago, when my father complained about a string of burglaries in their neighborhood. Of course, they had never bothered to change the master password or revoke my administrative access. They always relied on me to do the heavy lifting behind the scenes, yet they never found me worthy of a seat at their table. They only invest in children with a solid future. That is what my mother had said. They only invest in children with a solid future. The words echoed in my mind, perfectly matching the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Through the tablet screen, I watched a plain silver sedan pull up to their massive wrought iron gates. A man in a simple gray jacket stepped out holding a thick manila envelope. He was the process server I had contracted weeks ago, specifically instructed to arrive at this exact hour. He pressed the intercom buzzer. I could almost hear the harsh, unrelenting ring echoing through my mother's vaulted marble foyer, shattering the quiet aftermath of her pretentious New Year's celebration. Camera 2 showed the heavy front doors swinging open. My mother Beatrice stood in the doorway wrapped in her signature silk robe, her face puffy and irritated. She likely assumed it was a caterer returning for leftover equipment, or perhaps a neighbor dropping off a late holiday gift. She reached out and snatched the envelope with the practiced impatience of a woman who believed everyone was beneath her. I leaned closer to the screen, taking a slow sip of my coffee. My mother tore open the flap. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. At first, she just stared at the cover page. Then I watched her manicured hands begin to tremble. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. She was not holding a late Christmas card. She was holding a formal notice of foreclosure. Suddenly, my brother Marcus sprinted into the frame of the security camera, appearing from the grand staircase behind her. He was still wearing his wrinkled dress shirt from the night before, his usually perfect hair disheveled. He snatched the papers from my mother's hands. His eyes darted wildly across the text. He started shouting, gesturing frantically at the driveway, but the process server was already walking back to his car, completely unbothered by the panic erupting on the porch. Right on cue, my cell phone began to ring, vibrating aggressively against the quartz countertop. The caller ID flashed with Marcus' name. I let it ring 4 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the anxiety he had freely distributed to others for his entire life. Finally, I tapped the screen and accepted the call. "What the hell did you do?" Marcus screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure panic. I had not even said hello, but he was already unhinged. The confident golden boy CEO facade was completely gone. "Good morning to you too, Marcus," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "Happy New Year." "Do not play games with me, Nia," he roared, the sound of his heavy breathing echoing through the phone. "I am looking at a foreclosure notice. A foreclosure notice for my trucking company. Why in the world did the bank send this to Mom and Dad's house? What did you do to my accounts?" I listened to the terror in his voice. This was the same man who had laughed when his wife humiliated my 7-year-old son just a few hours ago. He was the golden child, the one who received hundreds of thousands of dollars in family investments because he supposedly had a solid future. They only invest in children with a solid future. Yet here he was, screaming like a trapped animal because his house of cards was finally collapsing. Marcus had spent the last 2 years playing the role of a highly successful logistics magnate. He bought expensive cars, wore custom-tailored suits, and threw money around like it was infinite. But I knew the truth. As a risk management director, I knew exactly how to track corporate filings and public debt records. His supposedly booming trucking company had been secretly bleeding cash for 24 months. He had taken out massive predatory loans to cover his gambling debts and to keep his wife draped in designer labels. And worst of all, he had somehow convinced our parents to put up their pristine Buckhead mansion as collateral to secure his failing business. "Did you hack into my company profiles?" Marcus demanded, his voice growing higher, shriller. Answer me right now. I am going to call the police. I am going to have you arrested for corporate espionage. You cannot just mess with my bank like this. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the last lingering chill of the previous night. The bank did not send those papers, Marcus, I said, making sure my tone was absolutely flat and merciless. There was a sudden dead silence on the other end of the line. I could picture him freezing in the foyer, exchanging a horrified look with our mother. What are you talking about? He whispered. The anger instantly replaced by confusion and a deep creeping dread. The bank did not send the foreclosure notice, I repeated, enunciating every single syllable so he would understand the gravity of his situation. I sent it. I bought the paper. I bought the loans. I just purchased every single ounce of your bad debt, Marcus. I am your bank now, and I am calling in what is mine. I disconnected the call while Marcus was still stammering out a string of desperate threats. The silence in my kitchen returned thick and incredibly satisfying. I set my phone face down on the cool quartz counter and took another slow sip of my coffee. On my tablet screen, the security feed showed Marcus pacing frantically on his parents' front porch. He was running his hands through his hair, his mouth moving in rapid, panicked bursts. Beside him, Beatrice clung to her silk robe, her face a mask of utter horror as she stared at the legal documents in her hand. They were finally experiencing the exact kind of suffocating anxiety they had freely subjected me to for decades. But my peaceful morning was far from over. Less than 40 minutes later, the heavy brass knocker on my own front door began to slam repeatedly against the wood. The pounding was frantic, aggressive, and entirely lacking in basic manners. I did not even need to check my security monitor to know who it was. I set my mug down, smoothed the fabric of my cashmere lounge set, and walked deliberately toward the foyer. I opened the door to find Harper standing on my welcome mat. She was a chaotic mess, a sharp contrast to her meticulously curated country club appearance from the night before. Her blonde hair was pulled into a haphazard knot, and she was clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. Before I could say a single word, she pushed past me, stepping right into my entryway with muddy designer boots. "Are you out of your absolute mind?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off my high ceilings. She spun around to face me, her eyes wide and brimming with forced tears. This was her signature move. Attack first, then immediately play the weeping victim. It was the same tactic she used at family dinners whenever someone challenged her ignorant remarks. I calmly closed the front door, locking the deadbolt with a sharp click that made her flinch. "You are going to ruin us over a stupid little joke," Harper cried, taking an aggressive step toward me. "A joke, Nia. That is all it was. I had a little too much champagne last night and I poked fun at Malik. Families tease each other. You do not send the bank to foreclose on your own brother's business because your feelings got hurt at a New Year's Eve party." She wiped at her dry eyes, her chest heaving as she tried to project absolute devastation. I just stared at her. The utter lack of reaction from me seemed to throw her completely off balance. She was used to people rushing to comfort her, rushing to smooth over the awkwardness she created. When I offered nothing but cold silence, she changed tactics. The tears vanished, replaced by a look of pure, venomous judgment. "Marcus told me you bought his debt," she sneered, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. "We both know you do not have that kind of capital, Nia. You are a freelance consultant. You live in a nice house, sure, but buying out a multi-million-dollar commercial loan. Who is funding this? Which one of your rich little boyfriends gave you the money to play corporate raider?" She crossed her arms, looking around my perfectly decorated foyer, as if searching for the invisible sugar daddy she assumed paid my mortgage. "You are using some man's money to destroy your own family. You are destroying my son's future. If Marcus loses his company, Hunter loses his trust fund. How can you be so selfish? How can you look at yourself in the mirror, knowing you are stealing from your own nephew just to prove a point?" I let her finish. I let the silence stretch between us until her false bravado began to crack. She shifted uncomfortably from one muddy boot to the other, her eyes darting away from my unwavering gaze. Lover's money, I repeated, letting a soft, genuinely amused laugh escape my lips. You honestly believe the only way a black woman can amass real wealth is by sleeping with someone who has it? You have spent the last 5 years looking down your nose at me, Harper, convinced that your marriage to the golden boy made you superior. Let me educate you on exactly who you are standing in front of. I stepped closer to her, forcing her to back up against the entryway console. I am not a freelance consultant. I continued, my voice low and lethal. I am the director of risk management for an elite sports agency. I handle the distressed portfolios and blind investments for 23 top-tier NFL athletes. I manage wealth that you cannot even begin to comprehend. I move more capital before breakfast than Marcus has generated in his entire pathetic career. Harper's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug superiority vanished from her features, replaced by a creeping, undeniable terror. Your husband is not a business genius, Harper, I said, making sure every word landed with maximum impact. That grand trucking company you love to brag about at your charity luncheons has been functionally bankrupt for 2 years. Marcus is a degenerate gambler. He has been taking weekend trips to offshore casinos and burning through company operating capital. When the traditional banks cut him off because his credit was garbage, he went to predatory private lenders. He leveraged the trucks. He leveraged your house. And then he convinced my foolish parents to sign over the deed to their estate as a guarantor for a final desperate loan. Harper shook her head in denial, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her purse. I bought that specific debt portfolio 3 months ago, I stated clearly. With my own money, legally, cleanly, and completely under the radar. I own the paper on his company, and I own the paper on my parents' house. You came here to accuse me of killing Hunter's future, but the truth is, Marcus killed it years ago at a blackjack table. I am simply the one holding the receipts. Harper began to shake visibly. She clutched her designer bag to her chest as if it could protect her from the absolute financial slaughter I was describing. But he promised me we were fine, she stammered, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. The tears in her eyes were real now, born of genuine fear rather than manipulation. He said he had it under control. He said your dad fixed it. He said Elias took care of the cash flow problem. She looked at me wildly, her carefully maintained reality fracturing into a million pieces right there in my foyer. Why would he need to put up the house? Dad gave him your money to cover the margin calls. I stopped dead. The air in my lungs seemed to turn to solid ice. My money, I asked, my voice suddenly stripped of all its smooth authority. What money? Harper clamped her hand over her mouth, realizing too late what she had just let slip. Her eyes went wide with panic. She tried to step around me toward the door, desperate to escape the conversation, but I blocked her path. I grabbed her arm, my grip tight enough to let her know she was not leaving until I had an answer. My money, Harper. What exactly are you talking about? She backed away, shrinking against the wall, her eyes darting toward the lock on the front door. The scholarship fund, she blurted out, her voice trembling with absolute panic. The $50,000 full-ride academic scholarship you won back in high school. The one Elias told you the organization rescinded because of a paperwork error. I felt a physical blow to my chest. The memory hit me with sickening clarity. I was 18, crying in my bedroom because my father had walked in and told me the foundation had pulled my funding. He had told me I was not good enough, that I had to be independent and figure out community college on my own. It was the moment that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of my entire life. He never gave it back to them, Nia Harper whispered, tears spilling over her mascara. He cashed the checks. He funneled your entire scholarship into Marcus's first business account to keep him afloat. Marcus told me years ago when he was drunk. I thought you knew. I swear to God, I thought you knew. I stood absolutely frozen in the center of my foyer. The floor beneath me felt as though it had completely vanished. Everything I had believed about my past, every struggle I had endured to build my career, every cruel lecture about independence I had swallowed from my father, it had all been a calculated, malicious lie designed to feed the golden child. I slowly let go of Harper's arm, my mind racing as a new, darker level of vengeance began to take shape. "Get out of my house," I commanded. My voice was eerily quiet, stripped of all emotion, yet it cut through the air with the force of a physical blow. Harper stumbled backward, her designer boots scuffing against the polished hardwood floor. She clutched her handbag tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. She had dropped a bomb she did not fully understand, and the sudden deadly stillness in my demeanor terrified her far more than any screaming match ever could. She scrambled for the door, twisting the heavy brass deadbolt with shaking hands, and practically ran down the driveway toward her luxury SUV. I did not watch her leave. I simply locked the door behind her and walked directly to my home office, my vision narrowing to a singular razor-sharp point of focus. The silence of my house wrapped around me heavy and suffocating. My heart pounded against my ribs, a steady, relentless drumbeat demanding the truth. 10 years ago, I was 24 years old, newly accepted into one of the most prestigious MBA programs in the country. Big Mama, my father's mother, had just passed away. She had always been the only person in the Wilson family who truly saw me. While my parents fawned over Marcus, grooming him for a corporate throne, he lacked the intellect to occupy. Big Mama would sit with me on her porch, asking sharp, insightful questions about market trends and investment strategies. She knew I had the real business acumen. When her will was read, it explicitly established a $500,000 trust designated specifically for my education and future business endeavors. It was my golden ticket. It was the ultimate validation from the only person whose opinion I genuinely cherished. But 3 weeks before my tuition was due, my father Elias had called me into his study. I still remembered the suffocating smell of his expensive cigars and the dark mahogany walls that always made me feel small. He sat behind his massive desk, steepling his fingers, and delivered the devastating news with a perfectly practiced look of paternal sympathy. The trust was frozen, he claimed. A severe clerical error in the probate filings had tied the funds up in endless legal red tape. It would take years to untangle, and the lawyers were advising him not to touch a single cent. Then came the pivot. The exact moment he twisted the knife. "Marcus needs liquid cash right now." Naya Elias had set his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "He is launching his logistics company. He is the eldest son. He carries the family name. We have to prioritize his venture." "You are smart. You have always been the resilient one. You need to learn how to be independent. Be independent. He is the eldest son. Be independent." That phrase had become the psychological loop playing in my head for a decade. It was the bitter soundtrack to my 20s. Be independent. He is the eldest son. Be independent. I had believed him. I had deferred my MBA admission. I had worked 80-hour weeks consulting for pennies, taking on high-stress, low-paying contracts just to keep a roof over my head. I clawed my way up the corporate ladder through sheer, agonizing willpower, sacrificing my youth, my sleep, and my peace of mind, all while Marcus used what I thought was our parents' money to play pretend CEO. I sat down at my multiple monitor setup, my hands trembling slightly as I brought the systems online. As a director of risk management, my digital access to financial histories, corporate registries, and banking trails was extensive. I possessed the tools, the clearance, and the expertise to track missing assets across global networks. I logged into a secured database bypassing standard firewalls to pull up the archived probate records for Big Mama's estate from 10 years ago. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing routing numbers and wire transfers. It took me less than 40 minutes to unravel a decade of meticulous, highly calculated lies. The trust had never been frozen. There was no clerical error. There was no legal red tape. Exactly 3 weeks after Big Mama's funeral, the entire $500,000 had been liquidated and transferred out of the secure account. I pulled up the digitized withdrawal authorization form from the bank archives. The document loaded slowly onto my high-definition screen, the stark black and white pixels illuminating the greatest betrayal of my life. There on the bottom line next to the notary stamp was my signature, I stared at the screen, zooming in on the blue ink until the pixels blurred. The loop of the N was slightly off. The slant of the A was too sharp. The pressure of the pen strokes lacked my usual fluidity. It was a forgery. A highly sophisticated, deeply malicious forgery. Elias had forged my signature to drain my inheritance. My own father had committed a federal felony, risking prison to steal my future. I did not stop there. I engaged a forensic tracking program to follow the digital paper trail of the stolen $500,000. The money had moved from my trust account directly into a shell holding company registered under Elias Wilson. From that holding company, the funds were injected straight into Marcus's newly formed trucking business, categorized as a founder's capital investment. That was the seed money. The entire foundation of Marcus's fake empire, his luxury cars, his country club memberships, his designer suits, his arrogant wife. It was all built on the ashes of my stolen inheritance. My father had robbed me blind to prop up his mediocre, incompetent golden son. He had watched me struggle, watched me cry over missed opportunities, watched me exhaust myself to the point of collapse, knowing all the while that he had $500,000 of my money sitting in Marcus's bank account. The lingering hurt I had carried for 10 years completely vanished. The desperate childlike desire for my parents' approval evaporated into the cold morning air. The betrayal calcified into something diamond hard and razor sharp in my chest. They had not just broken my spirit. They had committed grand larceny. They had treated me not as a daughter but as a resource to be plundered. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, staring at the undeniable proof of their crimes. I now owned the debt that was crushing Marcus. I owned the deed to my parents' sprawling estate. And now I held the documentary evidence of a 10-year-old felony that could send my highly respected status-obsessed father straight to federal prison. They thought they had successfully buried the quiet, observant girl who just wanted to be loved. They had no idea they had created an executioner who held all the cards. The harsh, demanding ring of my cell phone shattered the heavy silence of my office. I glanced at the caller ID flashing brightly on the screen. It was Elias. My father never called me during business hours. He rarely called me at all, unless he needed me to organize a family event, fix a technological issue for my mother, or demand my presence for some performative holiday gathering. I watched his name pulse on the glass screen. He was calling because Marcus had run crying to him. He was calling because the foreclosure notices had thrown their perfect, fraudulent world into absolute chaos. He was calling to fix the mess, fully believing he still possessed the authority to command me. I let it ring 4 times, taking a slow, deep breath to anchor the icy calm spreading through my veins. Then I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, saying absolutely nothing. Nia, my father, barked into the receiver. There was no greeting. There were no pleasantries. There was no inquiry about my well-being. It was just the booming, authoritative tone he used to terrify his subordinates and control his family for decades. "I know what you did to your brother this morning." Elias continued, his voice vibrating with barely suppressed rage. "I do not know what kind of ridiculous stunt you think you are pulling or how you managed to get your hands on those commercial loans, but you are going to stop this nonsense right now. You are tearing this family apart over a petty grievance." I remained completely silent, listening to the arrogant cadence of a man who firmly believed he was invincible. "I expect you at the Oak Ridge Country Club in exactly 1 hour, Elias demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "We are having an emergency family meeting in the private dining room. You are going to bring whatever paperwork you have, and you are going to transfer those deeds back to us today. Do not test me, Nia. You will not disrespect this family. 1 hour. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat of my car. I did not rush. I took my time, changing into a tailored charcoal pantsuit, the kind of immaculate garment that screamed corporate dominance and left no room for debate. I drove the winding, manicured roads toward the Oak Ridge Country Club with the windows down, letting the crisp winter air clear the last remnants of familial loyalty from my mind. Oak Ridge was an institution in Atlanta. It was a fortress of old money crystal chandeliers, heavily starched tablecloths, and generational wealth. It was exactly the kind of place my father used to intimidate people. He firmly believed the grand opulent setting would make me feel small, just like it did when I was a teenager begging for his approval. He was about to learn just how drastically the power dynamics had shifted. When I handed my keys to the valet, he greeted me respectfully by name. What my family did not know was that I was a platinum member here. Several of my high-profile NFL clients practically lived on the Oak Ridge golf course during the off-season. The maitre d' bowed slightly as I entered the grand lobby, immediately escorting me toward the private dining suites in the back. The heavy mahogany doors of the Magnolia Room stood closed. I did not bother to knock. I simply turned the brass handle and walked right in. The scene inside was a masterclass in absolute delusion. My family sat around a long, polished oak table set for a multi-course lunch. The room smelled of expensive steak-roasted truffles and aged red wine. Elias sat at the head of the table wearing a custom navy suit, looking every bit the formidable patriarch he pretended to be. Beatrice was seated to his right, draped in heavy pearls and a cashmere wrap, her posture rigid with practiced elegance. Marcus sat on his left, swirling a glass of scotch. He looked completely different from the panicked, screaming man on the phone a few hours earlier. With our father present to shield him, Marcus had miraculously regained his smug, entitled smirk. Harper was notably absent. She was probably still at home, hyperventilating into a paper bag after our morning chat. "Ah, the prodigal daughter finally graces us with her presence," Marcus drawled, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. "You kept us waiting, Nia." I ignored him completely. I walked past his chair, the click of my heels echoing sharply on the hardwood floor. I pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table, directly facing my father, and sat down. I did not touch the crystal water glass or the heavy silver cutlery laid out before me. I just clasped my hands on the polished wood and locked eyes with Elias. "Let us skip the theatrics," Elias said, his voice dropping into that familiar commanding baritone designed to demand immediate submission. He snapped his fingers without looking away from me. Marcus quickly slid a thick manila folder down the length of the table. It stopped inches from my hands. I looked at the heavy paper, but did not reach for it. "Inside that folder are the transfer documents," Elias continued, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "You will sign over the debt portfolio you purchased. You will execute a full release of the liens against your brother's company, and you will transfer the deed to our house back into my name today. In exchange, I will reimburse you for exactly what you paid those predatory lenders, plus a standard 5% interest fee for your trouble. We are going to pretend this entire embarrassing stunt never happened." He spoke with absolute certainty, completely convinced that his authority was still unquestionable. Beatrice sighed deeply, shaking her head as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store, rather than a grown woman holding their financial lives in my hands. "You really went too far this time, Nia," my mother said, her tone dripping with toxic, manipulative disappointment. "We raised you to support your family, not attack them like a savage. Do you have any idea how much stress you caused my heart this morning? Sending a process server to my front door like some common debt collector. It is incredibly shameful. We are a respectable family. You do not air our private financial adjustments in public." Private financial adjustments. I repeated, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of emotion. That is a fascinating term for massive, unmitigated fraud, Mom. Marcus slammed his scotch glass down on the table, the amber liquid splashing over the rim. "Watch your mouth," he snapped. "You do not talk to her like that. You think because you had a couple of good years playing secretary for some football players, you can suddenly sit at the big table. You are entirely out of your depth, Nia. You bought paper you do not understand. Dad is offering to bail you out of a bad investment. You should be down on your knees thanking him." I kept my eyes locked on Elias. He was watching me intently, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to read my total lack of submission. "You did not answer my question on the phone," Elias said, ignoring Marcus completely. "How did you get the capital to buy those notes? That kind of debt acquisition requires serious liquid cash. Who is backing you?" "Nobody is backing me, Dad," I replied, enunciating every single syllable so there could be no misunderstanding. I am the director of risk management for an elite sports agency that handles billions in athlete contracts. My personal net worth surpassed yours 3 years ago. I bought Marcus's debt with my own money because it was being sold for pennies on the dollar. The market recognized that Marcus's trucking company was absolutely worthless. I was simply the highest bidder at the fire sale. The color drained slightly from Beatrice's face, her hand fluttering nervously to her pearls. Elias just tightened his jaw. He hated being reminded that I was successful. He hated the reality that I had achieved more on my own than his precious son had achieved with endless family handouts. That does not matter, Elias growled, his voice rising, the sound bouncing harshly off the mahogany walls. The money stays in the family. You will sign those documents right now. You are acting out of spite because you always resented your brother. Sign the paper canceling the foreclosure immediately. As family, you are not allowed to destroy your brother over petty jealousy. The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the air. Petty jealousy. They really believed I was just a bitter younger sister acting out a petty grudge. They thought my motivation was a childish desire for attention. I looked at the man who had raised me. I looked at the man who had stared me in the eye when I was 18, weeping over my lost future, and told me to be independent, while he secretly drained my inheritance to feed his son. Be independent. He is the eldest son. Be independent. The psychological loop played in my mind one final time, echoing with years of exhaustion and pain, and then it shattered forever, leaving nothing but cold clarity. You talk a lot about family, Dad, I said, leaning back in my chair, unbothered by his rising anger. You talk endlessly about respect and loyalty, but those rules only apply when they benefit Marcus. You demand that I sacrifice my leverage to save a company that has been functionally dead for 24 months. Marcus blew through his operating capital at the blackjack tables in Atlantic City. He leveraged your house to cover his gambling debts. And yet here you are demanding I rescue him again so he can maintain his country club lifestyle. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door like a trapped animal. Elias did not even blink. He knew. I realized it right then, watching his stoic expression. My father knew exactly where the money had gone, and he was still covering for him. Business has ups and downs, Elias said coldly, his mask firmly in place. Marcus hit a rough patch. That does not give you the right to hold a knife to our throats. Sign the papers, Nia. I will not ask you again. I did not reach for the folder. Instead, I raised my right hand and caught the eye of the head waiter standing discreetly near the entrance of the private room. I gave him a small, precise nod. I am not signing anything, I said, returning my gaze to my father. And I am not returning the deeds. You see, Dad Harper paid me a visit this morning. She was very upset. She was so incredibly upset, in fact, that she started screaming about my scholarship fund. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was sudden, complete, and terrifyingly heavy. Marcus froze, his hand suspended halfway to his Scotch glass. Beatrice gasped aloud, her hand clamping over her mouth as she looked quickly at her husband in pure panic. Elias remained perfectly still, but a tiny muscle in his jaw began to twitch violently. The illusion of his impenetrable authority cracked just for a fraction of a second. I spent the last 2 hours going through the federal probate archives. I continued, my voice steady, merciless, and completely stripped of the daughterly obedience they had exploited for years. I tracked the routing numbers. I pulled the withdrawal authorization. And most importantly, I saw the signature. The forged signature you used to drain $500,000 from my trust account 10 years ago. Beatrice let out a strangled sob. Marcus turned a sickly shade of gray, suddenly looking very small and incredibly fragile in his expensive suit. Elias stared at me, his eyes dark and furious, finally recognizing that he was no longer dealing with a child he could control with harsh words. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. The head waiter entered, pushing a silver serving cart across the room. Resting on top of the cart was not a dessert or an expensive bottle of champagne. It was a large, heavy cardboard storage box, sealed tightly with tamper-evident tape. The waiter stopped the cart right next to my chair, bowed slightly, and quickly exited the room, closing the doors securely behind him. I stood up slowly, grabbing the heavy box and sliding it directly onto the center of the polished oak table. I looked directly into my father's eyes, watching the raw, undeniable panic finally begin to set into his features. I do not envy a thief, Dad. I reached out and ripped the tamper-evident tape off the cardboard box. The harsh tearing sound echoed through the private dining room, slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence. I flipped the cardboard flaps open and reached inside. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of forensic accounting reports, bank statements, wire transfer logs, and credit card histories. They were bound in thick black folders, meticulously categorized and highlighted. With a swift, deliberate motion, I slammed the first stack onto the polished oak table. It slid across the dark wood, stopping just inches from Marcus's spilled scotch. I pulled out a second stack, then a third, fanning them out across the expensive linen runner until the entire center of the table was covered in damning financial evidence. "Let us talk about your booming logistics empire, Marcus," I said, my voice sharp and completely devoid of any sibling affection. "Let us talk about the incredible business acumen Dad loves to brag about at his charity dinners." Marcus stared at the folders as if they were venomous snakes. He did not say a word. He physically shrank in his chair, his broad shoulders curling inward, all his previous arrogance completely eviscerated. I reached out and flipped open the top folder. The first page is the primary operating account for Wilson Logistics. You will notice the complete absence of actual revenue. What you will see, however, is a fascinating pattern of executive withdrawals. I looked up, locking eyes with my brother. $300,000 siphoned out in year 1 for a private villa rental in St. Bart's. $50,000 wired to a boutique in Paris for a custom crocodile Birkin bag for Harper. Another $80,000 for matching diamond Rolex watches. You treated your commercial business account like a personal piggy bank, draining the principal before the first fleet of trucks even hit the highway. Beatrice let out a sharp, offended gasp, but I did not stop. I picked up a red marker and tapped the next page. But the luxury vacations and designer bags were just the appetizer, were they not, Marcus? The real hemorrhage happened offshore. I flipped to a section heavily marked with yellow highlighter. Over the past 5 years, you have systematically wired $2.4 million to private high-stakes casinos in Macau, Las Vegas, and Monaco. You did not just have a bad quarter, Marcus. You are a degenerate, catastrophic gambler who threw millions of dollars onto a blackjack table and walked away with absolutely nothing. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head side to side. It was a loan. He croaked, his voice cracking. I was going to pay it back. I just needed one good run. One good run, I repeated, the disgust practically dripping from my words. You stole my $500,000 trust fund to cover your first massive failure, and when that ran out, you turned to corporate embezzlement. I turned my gaze to Elias and Beatrice. They looked like perfectly preserved statues slowly cracking under extreme pressure. "This is the reality of your precious family legacy," I said, gesturing to the sea of paper between us. "You walk around this country club like you own the city. You turn up your noses at people who actually work for a living, parading around in your tailored suits and cashmere wraps. You project this image of the untouchable elite black upper class. But it is all a pathetic, transparent lie. You do not have generational wealth. You have a house of cards held together by predatory loans, criminal embezzlement, and a complete lack of moral integrity. You are living on borrowed money and stolen time to maintain a hollow, artificial shell of superiority." The air in the room felt thick enough to cut. Elias sat rigidly, his hands balled into tight fists on the table, a muscle ticking aggressively in his jaw. He was a man who demanded absolute control, and I was publicly dismantling his entire identity. Beatrice, however, could no longer maintain her poised, elegant facade. The image of her perfect son was being destroyed right in front of her, and her maternal programming, the same programming that had always sacrificed me to protect him, went into absolute overdrive. She slammed her hands down hard on the oak table. The silverware rattled sharply against the porcelain plates. "He is your brother!" Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, shattering the quiet dignity of the Magnolia Room. You stop this right now, Nia. I will not sit here and listen to you assassinate his character. Family money is shared money. It stays within these walls. We do what we have to do to protect our own. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the depths of her delusion. Protect our own? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Where was that protection when I was 18, crying in my bedroom because I thought I had lost my future? Where was that protection when I was working myself to the bone, living on cheap noodles and panic, while you two secretly funneled my money to fund his gambling addiction? You did not protect me, Mom. You offered me up as a sacrificial lamb so your golden boy could keep playing pretend. You are a cold-blooded, heartless girl. Beatrice spat, her chest heaving, tears of furious indignation streaming down her cheeks. You have always been jealous of him. You have always been bitter. You are trying to destroy him out of pure petty spite because you could never be the child we needed you to be. Her words, which once would have shattered my heart, simply bounced off the impenetrable armor I had built over the last decade. I did not feel hurt. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. They were exactly who I thought they were. I am not jealous of a thief, Mom, I said, my tone absolute and unyielding. And I am certainly not jealous of a man who is about to lose everything he owns. I slowly reached into the cardboard box one final time. I pulled out a single heavily redacted legal document. It was not a bank statement or a casino ledger. It was a property contract bound in a stark blue legal cover. I placed it gently on top of the pile, smoothing the cover with the palm of my hand. I looked directly into my parents' eyes, locking my gaze with Elias, whose face suddenly drained of all its remaining color. He recognized the blue cover. He knew exactly what I had just placed on the table. You say family money is shared, Mom? I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, carrying whisper. You claim that everything stays within the family to protect Marcus. But the Buckhead mansion is not shared property, is it? You and Dad secretly cross-collateralized the family estate to secure Marcus's final desperate private loan, did you not? The silence that followed my question was absolute and suffocating. Elias stared at the blue legal cover, the color completely draining from his face, until his skin took on a sickening ashen hue. His absolute failure to deny the accusation was all the confirmation anyone in the room needed. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her throat as if she were suddenly choking on her expensive pearls. She turned her horrified gaze from the document to her husband, her perfectly manicured facade finally shattering into pieces. You put the house up, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely carried across the oak table. Elias, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not risk our home for a commercial loan. Elias did not look at her. He kept his dark, furious eyes locked squarely on me, his jaw clamped shut. He was a man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of impenetrable wealth and flawless control. To admit out loud that he had secretly mortgaged his sprawling Buckhead estate to cover his son's gambling debts would be an admission of total humiliating defeat. Before Elias could formulate a lie to pacify his wife, the heavy mahogany doors of the Magnolia Room violently burst open. Harper stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She had clearly raced straight from my foyer to the country club, tracking Marcus down in a sheer, unadulterated panic. She ignored the startled maitre d', hovering anxiously in the hallway behind her, and slammed the door shut with a resounding crash. She marched directly toward our table, her gaze darting frantically from the sea of highlighted financial documents to the blue legal folder, and finally to her husband. Marcus physically recoiled in his chair, raising his hands in a pathetic, defensive gesture. Tell me she is lying! Harper shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the crystal chandeliers. Tell me you do not owe her millions of dollars. Tell me you did not lose our son's trust fund at a casino, Marcus. Harper, keep your voice down, Marcus hissed, looking nervously toward the closed doors. People can hear you. We can fix this. Dad and I are fixing it right now. I am not fixing anything, I stated calmly, my voice easily slicing through his pathetic attempt at damage control. I tapped the blue folder with my index finger. The Buckhead estate is collateralized against your default, Marcus. The grace period expired 72 hours ago. The bank is not fixing this. I am collecting. Harper froze. Her eyes dropped to the blue folder, and the last remnants of her country club composure evaporated. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. There was no secret family fortune waiting to catch them. The generational wealth Marcus had continuously bragged about was a complete illusion. They were not members of the elite upper class. They were broke, heavily indebted frauds living on borrowed time. "You lied to me," Harper screamed, spinning back to Marcus with pure feral hatred. "You told me you were the sole heir to this empire. You told me Elias was handing you the keys to a kingdom. There is no kingdom. You are completely bankrupt." "Harper, please," Beatrice intervened, standing up on shaky legs and reaching out toward her daughter-in-law. "We are a family. We will close ranks and figure this out together. You must calm down before you cause a scandal." "Do not touch me," Harper snarled, slapping Beatrice's hand away with shocking aggression. "Family. You people are a joke. You walk around treating everyone like peasants, judging my background, judging my parenting when you do not even own the roof over your own heads." She turned her venom back to Marcus, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "I am not going down with a sinking ship, Marcus. I did not marry you to live in a cramped apartment and deal with debt collectors. I am calling my father's lawyers the second I leave this club. I am filing for divorce, and I am taking Hunter. You will not see him again until you can afford to pay the massive child support I am going to bleed out of you." Marcus leaped out of his chair, panic finally overriding his shame. "Harper, wait. You cannot just leave. I can turn the company around. I have a plan." Harper laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that lacked any trace of humor. "Your plan was to steal from your sister, and she just handed you your head on a silver platter. You are a loser, Marcus. You always have been." She turned on her heel, preparing to storm out of the room, but I simply could not let her leave without returning a very specific favor. "Harper." I called out, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. She paused, looking back at me over her shoulder with narrow, resentful eyes. "For the last 5 years, you have sat at my dining table and made it your personal mission to remind me that I did not belong," I said, leaning forward and resting my chin on my folded hands. "You told me my career was unladylike. You told me my lifestyle was improper. You constantly reminded me that I was simply not up to the standard of this family." I let my eyes slowly drag up and down her ruined, disheveled appearance. "It seems the tables have finally turned." I continued, hitting the psychological pressure point with absolute precision. "You only invest in a solid future, remember? Look at your husband. Look at your in-laws. It looks like you are the one who is no longer up to the standard, Harper. Feel free to see yourself out." Harper opened her mouth, her face flashing from pale to a deep mottled red, but she had absolutely nothing to say. She possessed no leverage, no wealth, and no counter-argument. She spun around, yanked the heavy doors open, and practically ran down the corridor, leaving the distinct sound of a collapsing marriage in her wake. Marcus collapsed back into his chair, dropping his head into his hands as a pathetic, strangled sob escaped his throat. Beatrice stood frozen in shock, staring at the empty doorway, as if she could not comprehend that the illusion of her perfect family had just been violently shattered. I turned my attention back to the head of the table. Elias had not moved. He had not rushed to comfort his weeping son or his horrified wife. He was glaring at me with a darkness that was genuinely terrifying. The mask of the sophisticated patriarch was completely gone, replaced by the cornered, vicious nature of a man who realized he had lost all his power. "You think this is a victory?" Elias growled, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, gravelly register. "You think because you manipulated some paperwork and humiliated your brother you have won. You are exactly what I always knew you were. A ruthless, ungrateful mistake." "I did not manipulate anything, Dad," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "I just stopped letting you manipulate me. The house is mine. The company is mine. The debt is mine. You have absolutely nothing left to threaten me with." Elias slowly stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with unnerving precision, his chest rising and falling with heavy, calculated breaths. He did not look like a man who had been defeated. He looked like a man reaching for a nuclear option. "You have always been too arrogant for your own good," Naya Elias said softly, leaning his knuckles against the polished oak table. "You think you hold all the cards because you control the bank accounts. But you forgot one very important detail. Money is not the only thing that dictates power in this world." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke suit jacket. He did not pull out a checkbook or a pen to sign the property transfer. Instead, he pulled out a crisp, neatly folded piece of paper bearing the distinct watermark letterhead of a prominent Atlanta psychiatric facility. He tossed the paper onto the table. It landed directly on top of the blue foreclosure folder. I looked down at the document. It was a medical summary. My medical summary. It detailed the severe postpartum depression, the anxiety attacks, and the exhaustion I had battled through alone 3 years ago after Malik was born. It was highly classified, deeply personal information that I had confided to a private specialist when I was at the lowest, most vulnerable point in my life. I felt a sudden, sickening drop in my stomach. "I told you to sign the release forms," Nia Elias said, his voice echoing with absolute merciless cruelty. "You want to take my empire, I will take your son. I have paid very expensive lawyers to prepare an emergency custody petition. I will submit this medical evaluation to a family court judge tomorrow morning. I will testify under oath that your high-stress career and documented history of severe mental instability make you a dangerous, unfit mother." He leaned closer, a sickening smile stretching across his face. "Sign the deeds back over to me right now, or I swear to God, I will have Child Protective Services at your front door to take Malik before the sun goes down." The words hung in the stagnant air of the Magnolia Room, toxic and heavy. I stared at the crisp white paper resting innocuously on top of the blue legal folder. It was a medical summary from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, when my body was still recovering from a traumatic emergency delivery, when my hormones were violently crashing, when I was awake for days on end listening to my newborn breathe because I was terrified he would stop. I had sought help. I had gone to a highly recommended specialist in strict confidence because I wanted to be the best possible mother to my child. And now the man who contributed half my DNA was using that vulnerability to destroy me. They were going to take my son. They were going to take my son. The psychological loop triggered instantly, a rhythmic pounding drumbeat in my ears. It was the same terrifying cadence of panic that used to consume me in the dark hours of the night. They were going to take my son. I looked up from the paper and stared into Elias's eyes. I expected to see at least a flicker of shame, a microscopic shred of parental hesitation. There was absolutely nothing. His eyes were cold, flat, and entirely dead. He was completely detached from the moral atrocity he was committing. I was no longer his daughter. I was simply an obstacle standing between him and his precious public image, and he was ready to obliterate me. "You think you can outmaneuver me in Atlanta?" Elias asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute submission. "You think your little corporate title protects you from how the real world operates? You are a fool, Naya. Judge Crawford plays in my golf foursome every Sunday morning. The chief psychiatric evaluator for the Fulton County Family Court sits on the board of my philanthropic foundation. The director of Child Protective Services owes his current appointment to my campaign contributions." He leaned forward, pressing his heavy knuckles onto the table, looming over the scattered financial documents. "I will file an emergency ex parte motion tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Elias continued mapping out my destruction with clinical precision. "I will present this documented medical history of severe mental instability. I will testify under oath that your recent actions buying up your brother's corporate debt, sending process servers to our home, attempting to foreclose on your own family, are the clear, undeniable actions of a woman experiencing a severe manic episode. I will request an immediate conservatorship to protect your assets from your own delusions, and I will demand temporary emergency custody of my grandson to protect him from a dangerous, unfit mother." A dangerous, unfit mother. A dangerous, unfit mother. The phrase echoed off the mahogany walls, sinking into my skin like poison. It was the ultimate nightmare weaponized against me. They knew exactly where to strike. They knew that my money, my career, and my independence meant absolutely nothing to me compared to Malik. Beatrice leaned across the table, her face arranged in a grotesque mask of maternal concern. The tears from her earlier outburst had magically vanished, replaced by a chilling practical resolve. "You have to understand, Nia, this is for your own good," my mother said, her voice dripping with toxic manipulative sweetness. "You have been so sick. You have always been so high-strung and emotional. Raising a child alone is too much pressure for someone with your fragile psychological state. Malik needs a stable environment. He needs a traditional, wealthy household to grow up in, not a mother who is spiraling out of control. Just sign the transfer papers, surrender the debt, sign the house back to us. We will put this entire ugly episode behind us, and you can go back to your quiet little life. We will not have to get the courts involved. We are just trying to protect our grandson." "You are not protecting my son," I said. My voice was a dead, hollow monotone. "You are trafficking him to pay your mortgage." Marcus let out a dark, bitter laugh from his side of the table. He had wiped his face and sat up straight again, buoyed by our father's ruthless counterattack. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the last drop of scotch in his glass. "You should have known better than to play with the big boys," Nia. Marcus sneered, his arrogance rushing back in a repulsive tide. "Dad warned you. You pushed too hard. You thought you were so incredibly smart, hoarding your little paychecks to buy up my debt. But you are just a crazy, bitter woman who needs a conservator to manage her bank accounts. Sign the paper. Give me my company back. Give Dad his house back. And maybe we will let you see Malik on alternating weekends." I looked at the three of them. My father the extortionist, my mother the enabler, my brother the parasite. They sat there with absolute unwavering confidence, entirely convinced that they had just checkmated me. They believed the threat of losing my child would instantly break my spirit, forcing me to surrender my leverage and crawl back into the submissive, invisible role they had assigned to me at birth. They expected me to weep. They expected me to beg. I placed my hands flat on the table, feeling the cool, polished wood beneath my palms. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of roasted truffles and aged wine, letting the oxygen fill my lungs and clear the ringing panic from my head. The fear evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity that felt sharper than a razor blade. I looked at the medical document again. I looked at the date. I looked at the signature of the doctor. And then I did the one thing Elias absolutely did not anticipate. I reached out, picked up the psychiatric evaluation, and tore it neatly in half. Beatrice gasped loudly. Marcus dropped his scotch glass. It hit the table with a sharp clink, rolling onto its side. Elias just stared at me, his eyes narrowing into dangerous, violent slits. I placed the two torn halves on top of each other and tore them again, then again, letting the shredded pieces of my deepest vulnerability flutter down onto the pile of Marcus's gambling debts. "You are bluffing, Dad," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute unshakable authority. "I am not bluffing," Elias roared, slamming his fist onto the table. "I will make the call right now. I will have the police at your house." "No, you will not," I interrupted, standing up from my chair to meet his towering presence. "Because you do not have the money to pay a family court lawyer. You do not have the money to pay off an evaluator. You do not even have the money to pay for the gas in your car to drive to the courthouse tomorrow morning." I pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at his chest. "If you had the power and the capital to put me in a conservatorship, you would have done it the second you found out I bought Marcus's debt," I said, dismantling his illusion piece by piece. "You would not be sitting here offering me a deal. You are threatening me with child protective services because it is literally the only card you have left to play. It is an act of total pathetic desperation." Elias opened his mouth to shout, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, but I cut him off, my voice rising in power and volume until it dominated the entire room. My medical records from 3 years ago proved nothing except that I sought treatment for postpartum depression and was successfully discharged. I continued staring him down. "Meanwhile, I have 20 separate forensic accounting files sitting right here that prove you committed federal bank fraud, by cross-collateralizing a residential estate to secure a commercial loan for a company that does not actually exist. Go ahead, Dad. Call Judge Crawford. Call your golf buddies. Let us see how quickly your elite social circle abandons you when the FBI knocks on your door to investigate a $2 million wire fraud scheme. The silence that crashed down on the room was deafening. The absolute certainty in my voice stripped away the last remaining layers of Elias's bluster. He stood there breathing heavily, looking at the shredded medical evaluation and the mountain of financial ruin surrounding it. He had played his most ruthless, terrifying card, and I had simply ripped it up and thrown it back in his face. Beatrice began to weep quietly, her hands covering her face as the true, inescapable reality of their complete financial annihilation finally set in. Marcus just stared at the table, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the crimes I had just laid out. "You are a monster," Elias whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "You are destroying your own blood." "I am simply surviving it," I replied, picking up my purse from the back of the chair. Before Elias could formulate another threat, before Beatrice could launch into another guilt trip, the heavy mahogany doors of the Magnolia Room swung open. The sudden noise made all of us flinch. The general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club stood in the doorway. He was a tall, distinguished man in a pristine tuxedo, but his face was tight with extreme, agonizing discomfort. He held a small black leather check presenter in his gloved hands. He stepped into the room, his eyes darting nervously between Elias and me, clearly sensing the radioactive tension hanging in the air. He walked slowly toward the head of the table, stopping directly beside my father. He did not offer the usual polite smile or the deferential bow he normally reserved for platinum members. He just stood there, holding the black folder out with a stiff, rigid posture. "Excuse me, Mr. Elias," the manager said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent room. "I am incredibly sorry to interrupt your family luncheon, but I was asked to inform you immediately." He opened the leather folder, revealing a small printed receipt with bold red lettering stamped across the top. "Your credit card was just declined." The words hung in the air, foreign and incomprehensible. "Your credit card was just declined." Elias stared at the manager. For a long, agonizing moment, his brain simply refused to process the sentence. Men like Elias Wilson did not have their cards declined. They did not experience financial embarrassment in private dining rooms at elite country clubs. They were the ones who dictated the rules, not the ones who suffered the consequences. "Run it again!" Elias commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He did not look at the manager. He kept his eyes fixed on the silver tray holding the offending piece of plastic. "You obviously made a mistake. Run it again." "Sir, I have already attempted to process the transaction 3 times, the manager replied, his voice maintaining a perfect, practiced neutrality that only seemed to infuriate my father more. I also took the liberty of calling the issuing bank directly to resolve the issue discreetly. They informed me that the account has been completely frozen due to an institutional hold. There is absolutely no available credit. Beatrice let out a small, strangled sound, pressing her linen napkin against her mouth. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, slumping even lower in his chair, fully realizing that the financial contagion of his failures had finally breached his parents' pristine sanctuary. I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my charcoal pantsuit and picked up my purse from the back of my chair. I unclasped the designer lock, reached inside, and pulled out a heavy matte black titanium card. I held it out. The manager stepped away from my father, walked the length of the table, and accepted the card from my fingers with a respectful, deferential nod. "You can put the entire luncheon on my account," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Elias snapped his head up. "How dare you!" He hissed, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. "You will not pay for my table. I will call my wealth manager right now and have this sorted out. This is a simple clerical error." "It is not a clerical error, Dad," I said, maintaining my absolute composure as I watched his panic mount. "It is the natural consequence of financial gravity. You cannot cross-collateralize an estate that is actively entering foreclosure. The moment I initiated the default protocols on the Buckhead property, The automated banking algorithms flagged every single line of credit attached to your name. Your wealth manager cannot help you because there is no wealth left to manage. The manager placed my black card onto the silver tray, but before he could turn to leave, I raised my hand to stop him. Actually, while you are processing the bill, I need you to handle one more administrative task, I said, looking directly at the manager. You need to officially revoke Elias's club membership, effective immediately. He no longer meets the financial threshold required to maintain his status at Oak Ridge, and he is no longer permitted on the grounds. Elias shot up from his chair. The heavy oak legs scraped violently across the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Are you out of your mind?" Elias roared, pointing a trembling finger at me, then violently shifting his aim to the manager. "You work for me. I have been a premier member of this club for 25 years. I will have your job by the end of the day. I will have you fired and blacklisted from every hospitality group in Atlanta." The manager did not flinch. He simply looked at me, waiting for my instruction. "He is not going to be fired." "Dad," I said, my tone as cold and hard as a diamond, "because you do not own this club. You just pay them to let you sit in their dining rooms and feel important. But I know exactly who does own Oak Ridge. The private equity firm that bought this entire property 6 months ago is majority owned by a client of mine. A client whose sports contracts and investment portfolios I personally manage. I secured his initial buy-in for this very establishment. I am not just a platinum member here. I represent the absolute top of the ownership pyramid." I watched the realization hit him. I watched the patriarch shatter. I watched the infallible, untouchable Elias Wilson realize that the fortress he used to intimidate me was actually my own castle. He looked around the magnolia room. He looked at the crystal chandeliers, the mahogany walls, the expensive art. He looked at the manager, who was looking at him, not with respect, but with profound pity. He looked at Beatrice, who was openly weeping into her hands, her pearls trembling against her chest. He looked at Marcus, who was too consumed by his own ruin to even offer a single word of support. "You have nothing left," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of his pride. "You do not have the house. You do not have the logistics company. You do not have the credit lines. You do not even have your country club membership." Elias was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom suit. He was trapped. He was completely outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outclassed. But a man like Elias does not surrender gracefully. He fights dirty. He fights with whatever weapons are left lying in the mud. He looked down at the table. He looked at the psychiatric evaluation sitting perfectly centered on top of the blue foreclosure folder. His hand darted out and slammed down on the medical document, his fingers curling over the crisp white paper. "I still have this," Elias snarled, his voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated malice. "I still have your son. You can take the house. You can take the club. But I will take Malik. I will take this evaluation to Judge Crawford. I will tell the entire world that you are mentally unstable, that you are having a psychotic break, that you are a danger to your own child. I will ruin your life in family court. I will make sure you only see your son through a supervised visitation window for the rest of your miserable life." He was panting, clutching the paper as if it were a life preserver. He was smiling a horrific, desperate smile. He thought he had found the one chink in my armor. He thought the threat of losing my child would finally force me to my knees. He was aiming for the absolute most vulnerable part of my soul, utilizing the same toxic, crushing pressure he had used to control our family for decades. "You are going to drop the foreclosure, Nia," he demanded, slamming his fist onto the table to emphasize his absolute authority. "You are going to restore my credit. You are going to fix this mess. Or I am making the call to the judge right now." I did not blink. I did not waver. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating panic he so desperately wanted to see in my eyes. I just felt a deep, profound pity for a man who had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. I reached into the heavy cardboard storage box sitting in the center of the table. My fingers bypassed the remaining bank statements and the wire logs. I reached all the way to the bottom and pulled out a single, pristine white envelope. It was thicker than the other documents. It carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper. I did not say a word. I simply opened the envelope, pulled out the document inside, and threw it across the table. It sailed through the air and landed perfectly flat, completely covering his precious psychiatric evaluation. Elias looked down. The document bore the official, undeniable blue seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I spent the last 2 hours going through the Federal Probate Archives, Dad. I said, my voice echoing with terrifying, absolute finality. I tracked the routing numbers. I pulled the withdrawal authorizations for my trust fund from 10 years ago, and then I made a phone call. I sent a digital copy of that authorization, along with 5 known samples of your handwriting, to an independent forensic laboratory run by former federal agents. I watched his eyes scan the page. I watched the text register in his brain. I watched the last drop of fighting spirit completely evaporate from his body, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified shell. They completed an expedited digital analysis. I continued my words, hitting him like physical blows. The conclusion is absolute. A 99% certainty of forgery. You did not just take my money, Dad. You committed federal wire fraud. You committed felony forgery across state lines. You stole $500,000 from a federally protected trust account. Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stared at the government seal, his hands beginning to shake so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. You think you can take a 3-year-old psychiatric evaluation to a family court judge? I asked, leaning closer, dominating his physical space. You think you can use your golf buddies to paint me as an unfit mother? Go ahead, walk into that courthouse, hand them your paper, and the moment you do, I will hand this forensic report to the United States Department of Justice. We will see exactly who the judge believes. A successful independent woman with a cleared medical history, or a desperate bankrupt man facing 20 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. Elias stared at the forensic report bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His pristine, rigid posture instantly collapsed. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and the vibrant, intimidating color completely drained from his face, leaving behind a mottled, sickly shade of gray. The heavy mahogany chair creaked in the sudden silence as he sank heavily back into it, the fight completely drained from his bones. For the first time in my entire life, my father looked exactly like what he truly was. Under the expensive suits and country club memberships, he was a weak, frightened, pathetic old man who had finally been caught. Beatrice covered her mouth with both trembling hands, letting out a sharp, breathless wail that sounded like a dying animal. She stared at her husband with wide, horrified eyes. The absolute reality of the situation was finally penetrating her thick shield of denial. She finally understood that her husband had not just made a poor business decision to help their son. He had committed a federal felony against their own daughter. He had stolen from my future to feed Marcus's toxic present. I remained standing at the opposite end of the polished oak table, towering over the absolute ruins of my family. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I felt an incredible surging wave of cold, calculating power. But that was just the appetizer, Dad, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated silence of the dining room. That was just the sloppy, desperate mistake you made 10 years ago to cover Marcus's initial gambling debts. You were arrogant. You thought I would never check the probate archives. You thought I was too stupid to question the authority of the great Elias Wilson. But what truly fascinates me is what you two decided to do next. I reached into the heavy cardboard box one last time. I bypassed the remaining bank statements and wire transfer logs. My fingers closed around a thick, legal-sized binder wrapped tightly in bright red tape. I pulled it out and dropped it onto the center of the table with a heavy, resounding thud. It landed right next to Elias's paralyzed, shaking hands. You see the trust fund? Money ran out eventually? I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, holding their absolute attention. $500,000 is a lot of money to a normal person, but it is absolute pocket change to a degenerate gambler sitting at a VIP baccarat table in Macau. Marcus kept losing. The logistics company kept bleeding cash. You needed new lines of credit to keep the entire fraudulent operation afloat. You needed massive commercial loans, but your own credit was already vastly overextended, and Marcus had a financial record that looked like a burning landfill, so you decided to get creative. Marcus let out a choked, ragged gasp. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark bone white. He knew exactly what was inside the red binder. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my father. A single heavy bead of sweat rolled down his temple, soaking into the starched white collar of his shirt. You needed a clean financial slate, I stated, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls with merciless precision. You needed someone with perfect credit, zero debt, and a spotless, unquestionable public record. You needed me, or rather, you needed my social security number. Beatrice let out another strangled gasp, dropping her hands from her face to clutch at her chest. "What are you saying, Nia?" she asked, her voice cracking with pure terror. "What did he do?" I kept my eyes locked on Elias. "For the last 10 years, you and Marcus have been using my social security number to open dozens of fraudulent shell companies across Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands." I opened the red binder, flipping through the pages of corporate filings, tax returns, and forged bank charters. I saw your names listed as managing partners, but the primary guarantor, the person legally on the hook for every single penny of debt, was me. You used my stolen legal identity to secure over $8 million in commercial loans. You funneled your illicit casino transfers through offshore accounts registered entirely in my name. The absolute horror of the betrayal hung in the air. They had not just stolen my money, they had stolen my identity. They had worn my name like a mask to commit massive coordinated federal crimes. You effectively turned my legal identity into a toxic dumping ground for your massive tax evasion scheme. I continued, my voice rising in volume and power until it dominated the entire room. You completely exposed me to the Internal Revenue Service without my knowledge. If the federal government had audited me at any point in the last decade, I would have gone directly to federal prison for corporate fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. I would have been locked in a cell for crimes I did not even know existed. You were entirely willing to let your own daughter rot in a federal penitentiary just so Marcus could keep flying first class and pretending to be a successful businessman. Beatrice turned to Elias, her hands shaking violently as she grabbed the sleeve of his suit. "Tell me she is making this up, Elias." My mother pleaded, her voice hysterical, tears ruining her immaculate makeup. "Tell me you did not steal your own daughter's identity. Tell me you did not risk putting her in prison." Elias did not look at her. He did not say a word to comfort his wife. He simply stared blankly at the red binder on the table, his mouth slightly open, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He was completely trapped. There was no lie left to tell. There was no manipulation left to spin. The paper trail was absolute, permanent, and utterly damning. "You stole my childhood," I said, leaning forward and planting my hands firmly on the table. "You stole my trust fund. But stealing my legal identity to shield your golden boy from federal tax evasion is where I draw the absolute final line. You told me I was not up to the standard of this family. You called me a disappointment. But the truth is, I was the only thing keeping this entire pathetic family out of prison." The crushing reality of the situation finally penetrated Marcus's thick, entitled skull. The absolute weight of the federal crimes, the impending divorce from Harper, the total humiliating loss of his wealth and status, it all hit him at once. His fragile, arrogant psyche simply snapped in half. He could not process the destruction of his ego. With a sudden guttural scream that sounded entirely inhuman, Marcus launched himself out of his chair. He lunged violently across the polished oak table, sending expensive crystal water glasses and heavy silver cutlery crashing to the hardwood floor. He scrambled desperately toward the red binder, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. "Give me that paper," Marcus roared, his hands clawing wildly at the scattered documents, tearing financial reports and bank statements in his blind panic. "I will burn it all. I will burn every single page. You cannot do this to me." But he never even reached the center of the table. The country club manager, who had been standing frozen near the doorway after delivering the news of the declined credit card, immediately snapped into action. He signaled sharply into the hallway. Two massive, broad-shouldered private security guards, who had been waiting discreetly outside the suite, immediately charged into the private dining room. They moved with brutal, practiced efficiency. They grabbed Marcus by his tailored suit jacket and hauled him violently backward off the table. Marcus thrashed and kicked, swinging his fists in a blind, pathetic rage, but he was completely outmatched. The guards slammed him down hard onto the floor. The heavy thud of his body hitting the ground shook the room. They pinned his arms forcefully behind his back, pressing his face roughly into the expensive Persian rug. Marcus writhed like a cornered animal, screaming absolute nonsense, crying and begging Elias to do something. "Dad, make them stop." Marcus sobbed, his face smeared with tears, and spit against the carpet. "Fix this, Dad. Tell her to stop. Tell them to let me go." But Elias just sat there in a catatonic state, utterly powerless, watching his precious heir be restrained like a common criminal. Beatrice was sobbing hysterically, covering her ears, as if that could block out the sound of her son being physically subdued. I stood perfectly still, watching the chaotic, miserable scene unfold at my feet. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. I calmly reached out, picked up the red binder, and tucked it securely under my arm. "Wire fraud and identity theft," I said, my voice cutting through Marcus's pathetic, muffled sobbing with icy surgical precision. "The federal penalty is 20 years, Marcus." Right on cue, as if the universe itself were answering my statement, the faint, unmistakable wail of police sirens began to echo in the distance. The sharp, piercing sound cut through the crisp winter air, steadily growing louder and more intense, as multiple squad cars rapidly approached the iron gates of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The flashing red and blue lights violently strobed against the frosted glass windows of the Magnolia Room, casting harsh, erratic shadows across my father's horrified face. The wail of the sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy, synchronized slamming of car doors in the courtyard outside. Elias staggered backward, bumping into the mahogany credenza. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground beneath his feet dissolve into thin air. He shot a desperate, wild look toward the hallway, then back at me. "You called them?" Elias breathed, his voice entirely hollowed out by fear. "I did not just call them today, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "I have been communicating with the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI for exactly 90 days. You thought I was just quietly buying up your corporate debt to force a simple foreclosure. You thought my ultimate goal was to take this ridiculous house and humiliate you at a country club. You drastically underestimated me. I spent the last 3 months handing federal investigators every single fraudulent ledger, every forged bank charter, and every offshore routing number you and Marcus created using my stolen identity." The heavy double doors of the private dining room swung open so forcefully they banged against the wall. The country club security guards, who were pinning Marcus to the Persian rug, immediately stepped back, yielding their authority to the men entering the room. 4 federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets bearing the unmistakable yellow letters of the FBI stepped into the Magnolia Room, accompanied by 2 uniformed local police officers. The pristine, elite sanctuary of the Oak Ridge Country Club had officially been breached by the reality of criminal justice. But they did not come alone. The last agent to enter the room practically dragged a hysterical, thrashing woman by the arm. It was Harper. She had not even made it to her car. The officers had intercepted her in the country club parking lot as they secured the perimeter. Her expensive designer coat was slipping off her shoulder, and her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. "We caught this individual attempting to flee the premises." The lead federal agent stated, his voice a flat, commanding baritone that instantly commanded the room. "She is listed as a primary co-signer on 3 of the fraudulent shell company accounts flagged in our warrant." Harper took one look at the federal agents, then looked at Marcus, who was still groveling on the floor, his face stained with tears and carpet lint. The absolute reality of federal prison materialized in front of her, and her survival instinct kicked in with ruthless, violent speed. "I did not know anything," Harper screamed. her voice cracking as she desperately tried to pull her arm away from the federal agent. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at her husband. He lied to me. He told me it was his money. He told me it was generational wealth from his father. I did not know he stole her social security number. I have a child. I am filing for divorce. You cannot arrest me for his crimes. He is a liar. He is a fraud. She threw the man she had sworn to love right under the treads of a speeding freight train without a single second of hesitation. Marcus looked up at his wife, his jaw trembling, his eyes filled with a pathetic, shattered disbelief. The golden boy, the untouchable heir, who had spent his entire life being shielded from consequences, was finally watching his entire world burn to ash. Marcus Wilson, the lead agent, said, stepping forward and pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and tax evasion." "No." Marcus wailed a terrible, high-pitched sound that scraped against the walls. "Dad, Dad, do something. Call someone, please." But Elias could not do anything. Two other agents were already moving toward him, instructing him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The untouchable patriarch of the Wilson family was being read his Miranda rights in the middle of his favorite private dining room. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut around Marcus's wrists echoed like a judge's gavel. They hauled him roughly to his feet. His expensive tailored suit was ruined, covered in dust, and the remnants of the water glasses he had shattered. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for a savior that simply did not exist. Beatrice watched her son being restrained, and something inside her finally snapped. The elegant, sophisticated matriarch who had spent 35 years criticizing my career, mocking my independence, and enabling my abusers completely collapsed. She threw herself onto the hardwood floor, crawling frantically across the shattered glass and spilled water until she reached my feet. She grabbed the fabric of my trousers, her knuckles turning white as she gripped me with desperate, clawing hands. "Nia, please." Beatrice wailed, the sound tearing from her throat in a ragged, ugly sob. "Please, I am begging you. Tell them to stop. Tell them you made a mistake. He is your brother. He is your blood. You cannot do this to him. You cannot send him to a federal prison. He will not survive." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at her tear-streaked face, her ruined mascara, the expensive pearl necklace clinging to her shaking collarbone. She was entirely willing to watch Elias weaponize my postpartum depression to steal my child just 10 minutes ago. She had smiled while they threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. But now that her precious son was facing the consequences of his own actions, she was suddenly pleading for family loyalty. "Please!" "Nia," Beatrice cried, burying her face against my knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything I ever said to you. I was wrong. We were all wrong. Just tell the agents it was a misunderstanding. I will do whatever you want. I will give you anything you ask for. He is your family." I stood perfectly still, letting her tears soak into the fabric of my suit. I did not step back. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at her with a calm, surgical detachment. I slowly bent down, bringing my face level with hers. I reached out and gently placed my index finger under her chin, forcing her to look up and meet my eyes. Her face was a mask of absolute terrified desperation, hoping against hope that she had finally reached the daughter she had spent decades training to submit. I leaned in extremely close, my face mere inches from hers. The room around us was chaotic, filled with the sounds of federal agents securing the suspects and Harper sobbing hysterically in the corner, but my voice cut through the noise meant entirely and exclusively for my mother. "Did you really think Elias managed to forge my signature on that trust fund withdrawal, all by himself?" I whispered, my voice smooth and chillingly quiet. "I saw the original release documents in the federal archives yesterday, Mother. I recognized your handwriting on the notary line. They are coming for you next." Beatrice froze. The breath rushed out of her lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. My words hit her with the concussive force of a physical blow. The absolute terror in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She knew I had her. The pristine, untouchable matriarch of the Wilson family was nothing more than a common fraudster, and her perfectly manicured hands were stained with the exact same crimes as her husband. I slowly stood back up to my full height, stepping away from her kneeling, trembling form as the federal agents fully secured the perimeter of the Magnolia Room. Harper was backed against the mahogany wall, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between the federal agents, her sobbing husband on the floor, and the heavy oak doors blocking her escape. A female agent stepped toward her, holding a pair of heavy flex cuffs. Harper physically recoiled, her survival instinct overriding any remaining shred of loyalty she possessed for the Wilson family. "Do not touch me!" Harper shrieked, batting her hands in the air. "I am a victim here. I did not engineer any of this. I am a mother. You are not putting those on me." The lead agent did not flinch. "Ma'am, your signature is on the incorporating documents for 3 offshore entities that were used to launder stolen funds. You are an active co-conspirator in a federal racketeering investigation." "I signed what he told me to sign," Harper screamed, pointing a vicious, shaking finger at Marcus. "He told me they were tax documents for a legitimate subsidiary. He told me it was standard procedure for wealth management. He is a liar. But he is not the one who built the system." Harper's eyes shifted from Marcus to Beatrice. The look of pure concentrated venom on her face was staggering. The alliance of convenience between the two women, built entirely on their shared disdain for me and their mutual worship of money, evaporated in a split second. They were two cornered animals, and Harper was fully prepared to rip Beatrice's throat out to save her own skin. "He is too stupid to run a multi-million-dollar international money laundering ring," Harper declared, her voice echoing sharply across the dining room. "Marcus can barely balance a checkbook. He did not know how to bypass the IRS flags. He did not know how to set up dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands. He had help." Beatrice slowly scrambled to her feet, her face turning a ghastly, bloodless white. "Harper, shut your mouth," she hissed, her voice trembling with panic. "Do not say another word without a lawyer. You are hysterical. I am not going to federal prison for you," Beatrice Harper snarled, taking a step toward her mother-in-law. "I am not losing my son because you decided to use your own daughter's social security number to fund your lavish lifestyle. I know exactly what you did." Harper shoved her hand deep into her oversized designer handbag. For a split second, the agents tensed their hands, dropping toward their tactical belts. But Harper did not pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, sleek, silver USB drive. She held it up in the air like a holy relic, her hand shaking violently. "I knew Marcus was hiding money from me," Harper confessed, turning her attention directly to the lead federal agent. "I suspected he was siphoning funds out of our joint accounts to pay off his gambling debts, so I hired a private investigator to clone his laptop hard drive 3 weeks ago. I was gathering evidence for my divorce proceedings. I was trying to protect my own assets, but I found something much worse." Beatrice lunged forward. The mask of the sophisticated, elegant country club wife completely shattered, revealing the feral, desperate criminal underneath. She let out a guttural, terrifying screech and threw herself at Harper, her hands outstretched like claws, desperately trying to snatch the USB drive from her daughter-in-law's fingers. "Give me that!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You ungrateful, lying tramp! I gave you everything. I elevated you from nothing." Before Beatrice could make contact, the female federal agent intercepted her, grabbing her fiercely by the shoulders and shoving her firmly back against the heavy oak dining table. Beatrice hit the edge of the wood, hard, knocking over a silver water pitcher that shattered against the floor. She struggled wildly, her expensive pearls snapping and scattering across the rug like tiny white marbles, but the agent pinned her securely in place. Harper backed away, her breathing erratic, but a triumphant, vicious smile spread across her face. She handed the silver USB drive to the lead agent. Marcus did not go to Elias when he needed to hide the stolen trust fund money. Harper explained, her words spilling out in a rapid, desperate confession. He knew Elias's accounts were too heavily monitored by the company board of directors, so he went to his mother. Beatrice is the one who forged the notary signatures. She is the one who orchestrated the shell companies using Nia's identity. I have the emails on that drive. I have the audio recordings of Marcus complaining about it. She explicitly instructed him on how to structure the dummy corporations so the IRS would flag Nia instead of them. Beatrice was the architect of the entire scheme. The room went dead silent. The only sound was Marcus's muffled sobbing from the floor, and Beatrice's ragged, panicked breathing. I looked at Elias. The formidable patriarch was completely broken. He stared at his wife with an expression of profound, soul-crushing horror. He had spent his entire life demanding absolute loyalty, controlling his family, with an iron fist, convinced that he was the undisputed king of his empire. Now he was standing in the ruins of his legacy, realizing that his own wife had been orchestrating massive federal crimes behind his back, stealing from his sinking ship to secure her own hidden fortune. "You," Elias whispered, his voice cracking, staring at Beatrice as if he were looking at a complete stranger. "You did this. You forged the documents in my house. I did it to protect our son." Beatrice shrieked back at him, all pretense completely gone. "You were going to let him go bankrupt. You were going to let the country club find out he was a failure." "I had to protect our image, Elias. Someone had to maintain the standard of this family. By sacrificing me," I interjected. My voice was calm, cutting through their pathetic domestic squabble with absolute clarity. "By turning my life into a human shield for your fraud." Beatrice glared at me, her eyes filled with a toxic, unrepentant hatred. Even now, facing federal prison, she could not fathom apologizing to the daughter she had deemed inferior. She simply viewed me as the collateral damage required to keep her golden boy afloat. I watched them turn on each other. The perfect, elite, untouchable Wilson family was nothing more than a den of vipers biting and tearing at each other's flesh the absolute second the lights were turned on. They had spent decades building an illusion of superiority, looking down on the rest of the world, looking down on me. And now, I did not even have to raise my voice to destroy them. They were executing their own demise with spectacular efficiency. The lead federal agent handed the silver USB drive to a cyber specialist standing near the doorway. He then reached down and picked up the red binder I had dropped on the table, flipping past the offshore account routing numbers and landing directly on the forensic analysis of the forged trust fund documents. He stared at the signature line. He stared at the notary seal. He slowly closed the binder and looked up, his gaze locking directly onto my mother. The atmosphere in this room shifted. The chaotic screaming and blaming abruptly died down, replaced by a cold, clinical, terrifying silence. Law enforcement was no longer investigating. They were concluding. The agent took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the table. He unclipped the secondary pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The sharp metallic clinking sound echoed off the mahogany walls, a sound that Beatrice had never in her entire privileged life ever expected to hear directed at her. "Beatrice Wilson," the agent said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that permitted absolutely no argument. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Beatrice let out a sound that did not belong in the Magnolia Room. It was a guttural scraping noise, the sound of a woman whose entire meticulously curated universe was violently collapsing into dust. She did not stand up. Her legs simply refused to support the weight of her sudden catastrophic reality. The pristine, untouchable matriarch of the Wilson family was reduced to a trembling, frantic mess on the floor. The female agent did not wait for compliance. She gripped Beatrice by the upper arms, hauling her forcefully to her feet with practiced mechanical efficiency. The sudden violent movement caused the remaining string of pearls around Beatrice's neck to snap completely. A shower of flawless white beads cascaded across the Persian rug. They bounced and rolled, clicking against the mahogany table legs like a countdown timer to her absolute destruction. She was trapped. She was exposed. She was nothing. The illusion of the great Beatrice Wilson was dead. The illusion was dead, and the suffocating power she had wielded over me for my entire life was entirely gone. The cold steel of the handcuffs locked around Beatrice's wrists. The sharp metallic clicking sound seemed to paralyze her nervous system. She twisted her neck, her perfectly highlighted hair falling wildly across her face, completely ruining her immaculate country club aesthetic. Her eyes wide bloodshot and filled with a frantic animalistic terror locked desperately onto mine, too. Nia Beatrice gasped, her voice barely a whisper, completely devoid of the sharp aristocratic command she had weaponized against me for decades. Nia, please. Do not let them do this. I am your mother. You know I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot stand there and watch them humiliate me. You cannot let them take me away. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had spent 35 years actively dismantling my self-esteem. I looked at the woman who had watched me cry, who had watched me break, who had watched me beg for a single ounce of basic maternal affection. I felt nothing. I felt an absolute profound emptiness, where a daughter's love was supposed to reside. The emptiness was powerful. The emptiness was liberating. Elias was being marched toward the heavy oak doors by two federal agents, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped in total, irrevocable defeat. The great titan of industry had been reduced to a shuffling, broken old man in a matter of minutes. Marcus was still blubbering uncontrollably on the floor, thrashing uselessly and crying out for a rescue that would never come. Harper stood pressed flat against the far wall, trembling violently, watching her wealthy, untouchable in-laws being corralled and shackled like common street thieves. Beatrice strained against the agent's unyielding grip, dragging the toes of her expensive designer shoes across the carpet as they pulled her toward the exit. She was weeping openly now, ugly choking sobs that ruined her flawless makeup, leaving dark, muddy streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. "Nia, please!" Beatrice begged, her voice rising to a frantic, agonizing shriek that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "I have no money. The accounts are completely frozen. I have nowhere to go. You have to help us. You have to save your brother. What are we supposed to do?" I stood perfectly straight at the edge of the dining table. I took a slow, deep, deliberate breath. I reached down and calmly smoothed a minuscule wrinkle from the front of my tailored suit jacket. The gesture was precise. The gesture was intentional. The gesture was an exact mirror image of the dismissive movement Beatrice had made on New Year's Eve right before she coldly exiled me from the family home. I stepped closer to her, invading her space, ensuring she could see the absolute lack of mercy radiating from my eyes. "This family only invests in children with a future, Mother," I said. The words struck her with the concussive force of a physical blow. Her jaw dropped open. The breath hitched violently in her throat, producing a strangled, choking sound. She recognized the words immediately. They were her words. They were the exact merciless syllables she had used to justify cutting off my college tuition. They were the exact surgical weapons she had used to excuse Marcus's endless expensive failures, while demanding my absolute unquestioning perfection. "You need to teach Marcus how to be independent," I continued, keeping my voice perfectly modulated, perfectly detached, echoing the exact cadence of her previous cruelty. "It is for his own good." Beatrice stopped struggling. The frantic fight completely drained out of her body in an instant. Her knees buckled abruptly, and if the federal agent had not been holding her firmly by the arms, she would have collapsed onto the hardwood floor for a second time. She stared at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying, soul-crushing realization that her own malice had been meticulously preserved, weaponized, and handed right back to her. The loop was officially closed. The psychological debt was paid in full. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults or curse at her. The profound, suffocating silence that followed my words was far more devastating than any explosive emotional outburst could ever be. I had not just defeated them financially and legally. I had completely erased their psychological power over me. They were ghosts to me now. "Take them out," the lead agent instructed, gesturing sharply toward the hallway. I took a single step back, clearing the path. I watched without a single blink, without a single twitch of remorse, as Elias, Beatrice, and Marcus Wilson were paraded out of the Magnolia Room in handcuffs. The heavy double doors swung open, revealing the corridor outside. The elite members of the Oak Ridge Country Club, the wealthy bankers, the influential judges, the high society wives who had worshipped and feared my parents for decades were all standing in the hallway, They watched the spectacle unfold in stunned, horrified silence. Cell phones were already being discreetly pulled out. Whispers were already spreading like wildfire. The Wilson family name was permanently, irrevocably destroyed. Their legacy was entirely radioactive. They would never be able to show their faces in polite society again. Harper remained in the private dining room, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso, shaking like a leaf caught in a hurricane. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a complex mixture of absolute terror and sudden profound respect. She had saved herself from federal indictment by throwing her husband and his parents to the wolves. But she knew exactly who had orchestrated the entire hunt. She knew exactly who held the power now. "You should call a very good divorce attorney, Harper," I said calmly, reaching out and picking up my leather purse from the mahogany credenza. "And you should probably start looking for a much smaller apartment. The primary residence in Beacon Hill is being seized by the federal government at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." I did not wait for her response. I did not care to hear her excuses or her desperate attempts to align herself with me. I turned my back on her and walked out of the Magnolia Room. I walked past the shattered crystal water pitchers, the overturned heavy oak chairs, and the scattered worthless pearls. I walked down the long, thickly carpeted corridor of the country club, entirely ignoring the frantic buzzing whispers and the wide staring eyes of the wealthy patrons who parted to let me through. They looked at me as if they were seeing me for the very first time, and in a way they were. I pushed open the heavy brass and glass front doors of the club and stepped out into the crisp, freezing winter air. The oppressive, suffocating physical weight of the past 35 years instantly lifted off my shoulders. I took a deep, unrestricted breath. The oxygen tasted like absolute victory. The cold air stung my lungs, but it felt remarkably clean. It felt like total, uncompromising freedom. I walked down the sweeping concrete steps toward the valet parking area. The black federal SUVs were already speeding down the long, winding, tree-lined driveway, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the distance, carrying the absolute ruins of my former family away to a cold, concrete cell. As I reached my car, stepping into the quiet solitude of the parking lot, a sharp, distinct buzz vibrated from inside my heavy wool coat pocket. I paused, pulling my phone out into the cold night air. The screen illuminated the darkness, displaying a high-priority encrypted email notification from my primary wealth management firm. I swiped the screen open with a steady thumb, my eyes quickly scanning the brief, highly anticipated text. "Transfer complete. The Wilson Manufacturing Corporate Headquarters, the Beacon Hill Real Estate Portfolio, and the Consolidated Cayman Island holding accounts have been successfully acquired and legally transferred to your private LLC." I locked the phone, the screen going black, and slid it securely back into my pocket. I looked back at the grand, imposing facade of the Oak Ridge Country Club one last time. The warm golden lights spilled out onto the snow, highlighting the exclusivity of a world that had always tried to keep me out. I had walked into that building as the forgotten, discarded daughter, the scapegoat they thought they could crush. I was walking out as the sole, undisputed owner of the entire Wilson empire. The morning sun broke across the sprawling, manicured lawns of the estate, exactly as the digital clock on my dashboard struck 9. I pulled my car through the towering wrought iron gates. They were already locked wide open. 2 federal seizure notices were plastered across the heavy stone pillars, their bright orange borders stark against the gray masonry. The pristine, suffocating silence that usually wrapped around this property had been entirely shattered. A massive, dented, yellow moving truck was parked awkwardly in the center of the circular cobblestone driveway. It was a cheap hourly rental, the kind that reeked of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. It stood in stark, humiliating contrast to the multi-million-dollar architecture looming behind it. The sleek imported sports cars that usually occupied the driveway were completely gone, towed away before dawn by federal asset forfeiture units. I stepped out of my car, the crisp morning air biting at my cheeks. I walked slowly up the path, the sharp click of my heels announcing my arrival. Harper was dragging a generic brown cardboard box down the front steps. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The immaculate country club princess had vanished. She was wearing oversized sweatpants and a stained gray hoodie, Her hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She was violently shoving designer handbags and silk scarves into the cheap cardboard, tearing the delicate fabrics in her frantic, panicked haste. She froze when she saw me. Her eyes darted toward the private security contractors I had hired to oversee the eviction. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the veranda, their arms crossed, watching her every move to ensure she did not take a single fixture painting or piece of silver that legally belonged to my LLC. "You do not have to stand there and gloat." Nia Harper spat, her voice ragged and exhausted. "I have literally nothing left. The federal agents froze my personal checking accounts at midnight. I am taking my son and moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. Are you happy now?" I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. "I am not here to gloat, Harper," I replied, my tone perfectly flat. "I am here to protect my property. You spent the last decade living a life of absolute luxury, funded entirely by my stolen identity. You drank the champagne. You wore the diamonds. You turned a blind eye to where the money was coming from because the lie was comfortable. You do not get to play the victim just because the bill finally arrived." Harper opened her mouth to argue, but the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped her dead. She swallowed hard, her jaw trembling, and hoisted the cardboard box into the back of the rusted moving truck. She did not say another word. She climbed into the driver's seat, the engine sputtering and coughing to life, and drove slowly down the driveway. I watched the truck disappear past the iron gates, permanently erasing Harper from my life. I turned and walked up the grand marble staircase. The security contractors stepped aside, opening the heavy mahogany double doors for me. I stepped over the threshold and into the grand foyer. The transformation was staggering. The oppressive, suffocating luxury that Elias and Beatrice had hoarded for decades was completely gone. The rare imported rugs had been rolled up and removed. The pretentious, overpriced modern art had been stripped from the walls, leaving behind pale, rectangular shadows on the expensive wallpaper. The massive crystal chandeliers hung over an empty, echoing void. The house was nothing more than a hollow shell. Without the stolen wealth padding its walls, it felt cold, sterile, and entirely lifeless. I walked slowly through the cavernous living room. My footsteps echoed sharply against the bare marble floors. I remembered standing in this exact room on New Year's Eve. I remembered the heavy velvet sofas, the roaring fireplace, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I remembered the absolute arrogance on my mother's face as she told me I was a disappointment. I remembered the smug, entitled smirk on Marcus's face as he drank liquor bought with my credit. It felt like a lifetime ago. Today, the room was stripped bare, scrubbed clean of their toxic, suffocating presence. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the back gardens. I was not going to live here. I had absolutely no desire to sleep in the rooms where my abusers had plotted my ruin. I did not want to breathe the same air they had breathed. But I was not going to sell it either. Selling it would be too easy. It would simply pass the property into the hands of another wealthy, entitled family who would lock the gates and keep the rest of the world out. I had a much better plan. I looked out at the rolling green lawns and envisioned the transformation. This monument to greed and exclusivity was going to be completely repurposed. The grand dining room where Elias had sneered at my ambitions would be converted into a state-of-the-art computer lab. The luxurious master suites would be knocked down and rebuilt as collaborative workspaces and mentoring lounges. The sprawling manicured grounds would host networking events and graduation ceremonies. This massive estate was going to become the official headquarters for the Big Mama Scholarship Foundation. Elias and Beatrice had spent their entire lives trying to erase the truth of our bloodline. They had hidden the fact that the initial seed money for the Wilson Empire had come from the relentless, back-breaking labor of our grandmother. They had buried her legacy to construct a fake aristocratic image tailored for country clubs and elite society. Now I was going to carve her name into the very stone of this property. The foundation would be dedicated exclusively to providing full-ride academic scholarships, housing stipends, and venture capital grants to Black students graduating from historically Black colleges and universities. Every single dollar that Elias and Marcus had stolen, Every asset they had hoarded, every offshore account they had tried to hide, would be liquidated and poured directly into the hands of the exact people they had spent their lives looking down upon. The pretentious Wilson name was going to be erased from this estate, forever replaced by the brilliant, unstoppable future of the young men and women who would walk through these doors. It was the ultimate, absolute purification of a poisoned legacy. I was taking the wealth they had weaponized to destroy me and turning it into an engine of generational empowerment. The sharp, echoing sound of heavy boots walking across the hardwood floor pulled me out of my thoughts. I turned away from the window. Malik, my lead operations director and the primary architect of my corporate takeover strategy, was striding across the empty living room. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, his tablet tucked securely under his arm. He had been with me since the very beginning of this corporate war, tracking the offshore accounts and building the irrefutable case we handed to the federal government. But it was not the tablet that caught my attention. In his right hand, he was holding something delicate. He stopped a few feet away from me. His usually stoic, analytical face wore an expression of quiet, profound respect. He did not say a word about the eviction, the moving trucks, or the empty house. He simply held out his hand. I walked through the house conducting the final security sweep. Malik said, his voice steady and reverent in the echoing space. The moving crew completely cleared the master suite, but they left a pile of discarded trash on the floor of your mother's walk-in closet. I found this shoved underneath a pile of empty shoeboxes. It looks like they tried to throw it away before they were arrested. I looked down at what he was holding. It was an old, faded black and white photograph in a cracked wooden frame. The edges of the paper were curled and yellowed with age, bearing the watermarks of a history my parents had desperately tried to destroy. It was a picture of Big Mama standing proudly in front of her very first bakery. She was wearing her flour-dusted apron, her hands resting firmly on her hips, her eyes shining with the exact same relentless, unbreakable fire that I felt burning inside my own chest. I reached out and gently took the cracked wooden frame from Malik. My fingers traced the rough, splintered edges of the cheap wood, brushing away the lingering dust. I stared at the image of Big Mama. They had literally tried to bury her beneath their discarded empty luxury. They had tried to smother the absolute truth of their origins under a pile of meaningless designer cardboard. But she had survived their purge. The honest, back-breaking labor that had actually built the foundation of their entire stolen empire had outlasted their fragile, glittering lies. My vision blurred slightly as a single silent tear tracked down my cheek. I blinked it away, shifting my focus from the faded photograph in my hands to the man standing in front of me. A profound, radiant smile broke across Malik's usually stoic face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. We had successfully dismantled a corrupt dynasty brick by fraudulent brick. We had secured the assets, routed the remaining funds into the impenetrable trust, and permanently immunized my legal identity against their venom. I had won. A sudden bright sound of rapid footsteps echoed sharply against the bare marble floor of the grand foyer. My young son came sprinting around the corner, his small sneakers squeaking as he tried to navigate the massive empty living room. His pure, uninhibited laughter bounced off the high ceilings, instantly filling the cold, cavernous space with a profound, radiant warmth it had never known before. I dropped directly to my knees, holding my arms wide open. He crashed into my chest with joyful momentum, wrapping his small arms tightly around my neck. I buried my face in his soft hair, breathing in the scent of him, letting the absolute reality of the moment wash over me. I pulled him closer, holding him so securely that the entire world outside this room simply ceased to exist. I had done it. I had protected my child from the generational curse that had tried to swallow me whole. I had cleared my name, reclaimed my stolen future, and built an impenetrable fortress around our lives. They would never, ever be able to touch us again. The wheels of federal justice moved with a terrifying, merciless efficiency once the FBI had full access to the offshore ledgers and Beatrice's detailed email correspondence. The ensuing trial was a rapid, humiliating spectacle that captivated the local media. Marcus's highly paid defense attorneys, funded by the last desperate scraps of Elias's legitimate credit, could not save him from the undeniable concrete digital footprint he had so carelessly left behind. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom on the day of his sentencing, watching with clinical detachment as the judge handed down a mandatory 8-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The golden boy, the untouchable, arrogant heir, who had spent his entire pampered existence believing that consequences were exclusively reserved for poor people, completely broke down. He wept openly at the defense table, his shoulders shaking as the bailiffs approached him with heavy chains. He turned around, his tear-streaked face searching the gallery for his parents, desperately hoping Elias would magically intervene. But Elias and Beatrice were entirely powerless. They sat 2 rows ahead of me, staring blankly ahead, hollowed out by their own impending ruin. The Federal Asset Forfeiture Division had executed a total catastrophic sweep of their remaining wealth. The courts seized the downtown penthouses, the luxury vehicles, the country club equity, and the frozen bank accounts to cover the massive restitution and IRS penalties. Within 30 days of the trial, Beatrice and Elias Wilson were forcibly evicted from their temporary high-rise rental. Stripped of every single asset they possessed, they were forced to relocate to a cramped, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment complex on the absolute outer forgotten fringes of Atlanta. The poetic justice of their new reality was absolute. The elite insular social circles they had sacrificed their souls to impress instantly and permanently turned their backs on them. Their calls to former business partners and society friends went straight to voicemail. Their invitations vanished. The Buckhead aristocrats treated the Wilson name like a highly contagious disease. Beatrice, a woman who used to publicly humiliate servers for serving the wrong vintage of imported champagne, was now forced to count pennies at a discount grocery store, hiding her face beneath a cheap scarf to avoid being recognized. Elias, the former titan of industry who commanded boardrooms with an iron fist, was reduced to sitting in a worn-out fabric recliner, staring blankly at a water-stained wall completely erased from the corporate world he had worshipped. They were entirely cut off, isolated in a prison of their own making, left to rot in the exact obscurity they had always terrified them. Meanwhile, the sprawling Buckhead estate was experiencing a magnificent, unstoppable rebirth. I refused to let the property sit empty, and I absolutely refused to let it return to the hands of another corrupt, entitled family. The contractors worked around the clock for 6 months. The pretentious, suffocating dining rooms where I had been endlessly mocked were knocked down and transformed into expansive, sunlit, collaborative workspaces. The opulent master suites were converted into state-of-the-art technology labs and mentoring lounges. By late autumn, the heavy wrought iron gates were permanently locked open. The property was officially inaugurated as the headquarters for the Big Mama Scholarship Foundation. The sweeping, manicured lawns were no longer reserved for exclusive, arrogant garden parties. Instead, they were filled with the brilliant, vibrant energy of young Black students from historically Black colleges and universities across the country. I watched them walk through the grand mahogany doors, carrying their textbooks and their massive, unshakable ambitions. They were receiving full-ride academic scholarships, housing stipends, and venture capital grants funded entirely by the liquidated assets my abusers had tried to hoard. I had taken the very weapon they used to destroy me and forged it into an engine of generational wealth for the exact people my parents had spent their lives looking down upon. I stood on the front veranda of the estate, the afternoon sun warming my face. I looked out over the thriving, bustling campus, holding the framed photograph of Big Mama tightly against my side. The air was filled with the sound of brilliant minds debating, planning, and building their futures. They used to tell me I was never quite good enough to sit at their table. They constantly reminded me that I lacked the pedigree, the ruthlessness, and the polished perfection required to share their space. They were right. I did not belong at that rotten, collapsing table. I was never meant to inherit a corrupt, decaying legacy built on the backs of stolen labor and forged signatures. I was born to buy the entire damn house and build my own throne from the ground up. Never shed a single tear for the people who look you in the eye and refuse to treat you like family. Never beg for a seat at a table where you are continuously served disrespect. Let them cry. Let them sit in the dark, suffocating ruins of their own arrogance, and let them weep when they are finally forced to see the absolute devastating price of losing you. I reached down and took my son's small, warm hand in mine. He looked up at me, his eyes bright and full of infinite possibilities. I smiled a genuine, unbreakable smile, and together we stepped off the marble porch, walking away from the shadows of the past and directly into the brilliant, blinding light of the sun.